Welcome to those who came back for the quiet kind of victory. Most revenge stories move in fire, loud, impulsive, satisfying in the moment, and ruinous afterward. This one moves in signatures. The strategy here, signing away a minor claim to lure an opposition into false security, while a separate jury trial proceeds untouched, is the kind of legal precision that most people never see coming. Welcome to Historical Manhwa. The pen smelled like synthetic rubber and the faint chemical residue of a cleaning product someone had used on the conference table. Not a pleasant smell, not a subtle one either. Serena Voss noticed it the way she noticed most things now. Filed, cataloged, stored somewhere behind her sternum, where she kept everything that might eventually be useful. She did not look at the pen the way a nervous person looks at a pen. She did not tap it against the table. She did not glance at her reflection in the polished surface of the document in front of her. She simply sat, and she breathed, and she kept her face perfectly, professionally still. Across the table, Derek Paulson, lead counsel for Vantage Medical Supply Corporation, was watching her with the patient. A faintly predatory stillness of a man who had done this many times before and knew exactly how it ended. He had thick fingers. A watch that cost more than her rent in her old apartment. A palely even tan that suggested a man who vacationed regularly and efficiently, who maximized his leisure hours with the same spreadsheet precision he brought to depositions and settlement conferences. He believed he was winning. She let him. "Ms. Voss," said the mediator to her left, a woman named Patricia Engel, whose voice had the trained, neutral quality of someone paid to stand between two fires without catching. "You've had sufficient time to review the terms?" "I have," Serena said, "and you understand that by signing this agreement, you are releasing Vantage Medical Supply Corporation from all claims arising from the incident of March 12th. Serena's voice did not waver. "Yes, I understand." The mediator gave a small, professional nod and slid the document 2 inches closer. $10,000. That was what they were giving her. $10,000 for a fractured wrist, 3 missed pay periods, and 6 weeks of physical therapy she had paid for out of pocket. $10,000 for the loading dock accident that Vantage's internal safety report had quietly reclassified from equipment malfunction to employee negligence, approximately 4 days after it happened. 4 days. The ink on their own accident report hadn't even finished drying when someone in their risk management department picked up the reclassification stamp. In her first life, she had cried signing this. Not loud crying. Not the kind of crying anyone in the room would have registered. Just the small, hot pressure behind her eyes that she'd pushed down with the desperate efficiency of a woman who had a landlord who didn't accept grief as a form of currency. She had signed, she had taken the check, she had said thank you, which was the part she still couldn't entirely forgive herself for. Thank you. She had said thank you to the man who had just paid her $10,000 to stop asking questions about a defective hydraulic lift that had already injured 2 other warehouse employees in the 14 months before it broke her wrist. Now she sat in the same chair, different conference room, same energy, same man across the table, same watch. And she pressed the pen to the signature line and she signed her name. Serena Io Voss. Neat, unhurried, the signature of a woman who had made her peace. Derek Paulson's expression did something subtle and triumphant. Not to smile. More the relaxation of a held tension, like a cable going slightly slack. He reached across the table and drew the document toward himself, and he looked at it the way men like him look at things they've won. Which is to say, he barely looked at it at all. Just a quick confirming glance, already thinking about his next meeting. "The check will be processed within 5 business days," he said, because it was what he always said, because the settlement was already done in his mind before the pen ever moved. "That's fine," Serena said. She stood. She shook Patricia Engel's hand. She did not shake Derek Paulson's hand, but she did give him a nod that was so professionally neutral he would not know until much later. Possibly never, depending on his capacity for self-reflection, whether it had been dismissive or respectful. She picked up her leather folder, walked to the door, and stepped out into the hallway. The hallway was fluorescent and long and smelled like the 3rd floor of a building that had not updated its HVAC system since the early 2000s. A ficus in a plastic pot stood near the elevator. Someone had tied a cheerful yellow ribbon around the pot. The ribbon had faded. Serena pressed the elevator button. She waited. Oh, she did not think about what just happened because she had already thought about it approximately 5,000 times over the course of the last 14 months, and there was nothing left to examine. She had turned the strategy over so many times it had worn smooth. It was past the point of deliberation. It was simply done. The elevator opened. She stepped in. She did not smile until the doors were fully closed. She had died on a Tuesday. Not dramatically. Not with any cinematic awareness of the moment or any sense that the universe was drawing a long, careful breath before delivering the final line. She had died in a hospital bed in St. Clement's Medical Center on a Tuesday evening in February. With a blood clot in her left leg that had traveled in the dark while the nurses changed shifts and no one was watching the monitor with quite enough attention. She had been 31 years old, she had been broke, she had been 3 weeks away from losing her apartment because the $10,000 had run out, stretched, rationed, mortified, and she had been working at a fulfillment center 22 hours a week because her wrist hadn't healed right and she couldn't manage the loading work she'd been doing before. The last thing she had thought, as consciousness went down like a light switch, was something practical and embarrassing. She had thought, I never filed the second claim. Because there was a second claim. She had known there was, even in her first life. Oh, through the fog of pain and exhaustion, and the particular species of defeat that settles in when you've been ground down long enough, some part of her had registered the wrongness of what Vantage had done. Not just the accident. The reclassification. The reclassification was the tell. You don't reclassify an equipment malfunction as employee negligence 4 days after the fact unless you're covering something. And the thing they were covering, she had learned this much later, too late, from a man named Carlton Reese, who worked in Vantage's logistics division and who had too many drinks at a company function and said too much to someone he thought was a stranger, was a pattern. Not one defective lift. B3. Not one injured worker. 7. Not one suppressed incident report. A system. Annette Carlton Reese had told this to a woman named Diane at the company function. Diane had told it to her friend. Her friend had told it to Serena over the phone 2 weeks before Serena died, as a piece of gossip, because her friend didn't know what Serena knew. Didn't know what it meant. Didn't know that Serena was lying in a hospital bed doing the math on a case she no longer had the time or the physical capacity to pursue. She had thought, I never filed the second claim. And then the light switch. She woke up in her old apartment, the one with the yellow walls. She had painted them herself with a roller and a secondhand can of paint she'd found at the Reese store. A cheerful, optimistic yellow that she had eventually come to hate, that she had stared at through 3 winters and 2 lease renewals. She woke up in this apartment at 6:14 in the morning on a day she did not immediately recognize, and she lay still for approximately 3 minutes, processing the impossible weight of what was happening. She knew what it was. She was not a woman prone to magical thinking, but she had enough information to evaluate the evidence in front of her. The yellow walls, her wrist, which did not hurt, the sound of the street below, a particular quality of traffic noise that placed her in the old neighborhood with the Chinese restaurant on the corner that always propped its back door open in the morning. And the date. She reached for her phone, the old phone, the cracked screen, the model she hadn't owned in 2 years, and she looked at the date. Oh, and she felt something move through her that was not quite joy and not quite grief and not quite nausea, but had qualities of all 3. 8 months before the accident, 8 months before Derek Paulson, 8 months before the settlement, the wrong wrist, the blood clot, the light switch. She put the phone face down on the mattress. She looked at the yellow ceiling. She breathed through her nose, out through her mouth, the way the physical therapist in her first life had taught her. She said quietly to the ceiling, "All right." And then she got up. The first thing she did was find a lawyer. Not a general practice lawyer, not the kind with the billboard on Route 9 who handles car accidents and workers' comp and family court in 3 different counties. She needed a plaintiff's attorney who specialized in workplace injury. And specifically, this was the piece most people didn't know to look for. One with demonstrable experience in products liability class actions. Someone who had walked into a courtroom and said, on behalf of injured workers, this was not an accident, this was a design choice. And we can prove it. It took her 6 weeks to find Eleanor Marsh. 6 weeks of evenings reading court records on her laptop, while the yellow walls went gold and then gray with the changing light. 6 weeks of Bar Association databases and Westlaw case summaries and law review articles about multi-plaintiff tort litigation that she read and reread until she understood them. She was not a lawyer. She had a 2-year business administration degree from a community college. A fact that Derek Paulson had noted in a meeting in her first life with a particular species of dismissiveness that she had absorbed and now intended to return. She was not a lawyer, but she was, it turned out, excellent at research. She had always been excellent at research, at finding the one data point in a pile that didn't belong, the one number that was slightly wrong, the one internal memo with an unusual timestamp. It was the thing she had always been quietly good at, in the way people are good at things no one has ever asked them to leverage. There was a particular kind of loneliness to the research phase that Serena had not anticipated. She had expected the work itself to feel focused, purposeful, which it did. She had not expected the evenings in the apartment to feel so specifically quiet. Not empty, quiet. Yea, there was a distinction she had learned to hold. Empty was a room that had nothing in it. Quiet was a room where the person inside was the only sound. She ate her dinners alone at the kitchen table with the yellow walls and the legal pads. She drank her corner store coffee and read court documents on her laptop and made margin notes in a handwriting that had gotten smaller and more precise over the years, as if her thoughts had learned to take up less space because space was a resource she had rarely had enough of. Once, in the 3rd week, she went to a bar with a woman from her office, a woman named Greta, who was 45 and funny and had worked at the brokerage for 9 years and possessed the particular institutional knowledge of someone who had survived 2 ownership changes and 1 near bankruptcy and had learned to find genuine pleasure in small daily things. They had 2 drinks. They talked about Greta's garden and about a novel they had both read, and about a client at the brokerage whose investment strategy suggested he believed he was going to live to approximately 240 years old. Serena laughed twice during that conversation, and both times the laughter surprised her slightly, came up unexpectedly from somewhere below the level of strategy and preparation. It felt clean. It was like something that had been filed away for later and had quietly been waiting. She walked home afterward through the October evening. A man was selling roasted nuts from a cart on the corner, the warm, starchy smell of them drifting into the cold air. She bought a bag and ate them as she walked, the paper bag warm against her palm, the salt and the sweetness and the cold air combining into something that required no analysis. She was building a case that would take 14 months to reach a jury. She was also, in the margins, still a person. Both things were true. She was learning to hold both things. Eleanor Marsh had won 4 class action verdicts in the last decade, 3 involving product liability, 2 against national corporations. She had graduated from Georgetown Law. She had short gray hair, a voice like a cello, and a corner office in a building that was not fancy enough to make her clients feel judged and not shabby enough to make them feel unprotected. Serena walked into that office on a Wednesday morning, carrying a folder of documentation she had spent 6 weeks building and placed it on the desk between them. Eleanor Marsh opened it. She did not speak for 4 minutes. When she looked up, there was something in her face that was not excitement. Eleanor Marsh did not do excitement, Serena would learn, but was instead the particular intensity of a person recognizing the shape of something worth her time. "How did you get the OSHA variance records?" she asked. "They're public documents," Serena said. You file a records request. Most people don't know to ask for variance records specifically." "I know what I'm looking for." Eleanor Marsh looked at her for a moment, then she looked back at the folder. "You said there are 7 other injured workers." "That I know of. There are almost certainly more." "And the reclassification of your incident report?" 4 days after the fact, the original report codes the cause as hydraulic system failure, component fatigue. The revised report codes it as operator error, improper load distribution. Same incident, different classification, different liability outcome. Eleanor tapped the document with 2 fingers. "Do you have the original?" "I have a copy. The original is still in their system. It won't have been deleted because they don't know I have it, and they have no reason to think it matters." This was the thing that made Serena's chest tighten. slightly, with something she would not call satisfaction but was close to it. In her first life, she had never known about the original report. She had never known to ask for the variance records. She had never known what Carlton Reese said at the company function because she hadn't died yet, and her friend's phone call hadn't happened yet. She had walked into the settlement blind with a workers' comp attorney who handled 30 cases a month and had 15 minutes for hers. And she had signed because $10,000 felt like a lifeline when you were drowning. As now she sat across from Eleanor Marsh with 8 months and a copy of a suppressed incident report and the names of 6 other workers who had all, in their own quiet and separate desperation, taken settlements that closed their claims without knowing they could have opened something much larger. "If I file a claim now," Serena said, "they'll settle fast, especially if they think it's just a workers' comp dispute, especially if I look—" She paused, chose the word precisely. "Manageable." Eleanor looked at her. "Go on," she said. "There are 2 separate causes of action here. The workers' comp claim, my specific injury, my specific damages, and the product's liability claim, which is the defective equipment, and the pattern of suppressed reports. If I file both simultaneously, they'll see the product's liability piece, and they'll lawyer up aggressively. They'll slow everything down. They'll demand discovery. They'll run the clock. I don't have unlimited resources to run the clock." "So you want to file the workers' comp claim alone," Eleanor said, "and let them settle it." A pause. "And the product's liability case?" "Filed separately, different court, different caption. Filed under the product's liability statute, so the caption reads Voss versus Hayden Industrial Systems, Hayden being the manufacturer of the hydraulic lifts, not Voss versus Vantage. By the time they connect the 2 cases, the workers' comp settlement will already be signed." Eleanor Marsh sat very still. "The settlement agreement on the workers' comp claim," she said slowly, "will release Vantage from liability for the specific incident of injury. But it will not release Hayden Industrial Systems because Hayden is a separate defendant. And it will not release Vantage from liability under a product's liability theory because a standard workers' comp release doesn't contemplate third-party products liability unless it specifically names the theory and the party," Serena said. "Derek Paulson will draft a release that covers Vantage under workers' comp and general negligence. He will not name Hayden because he doesn't know I'm going after Hayden, and he will not specifically bar the product's liability theory because he doesn't know I know about the other 6 workers and the suppressed reports." She watched Eleanor work through it. It was a clean structure. Somewhat it was clean precisely because it operated in the gap between what the opposition knew and what they didn't, which was the only gap that ever reliably mattered. Most plaintiffs came in with everything visible. All their cards on the table, all their damages calculated, all their theories of liability announced up front. The defense prepared for all of it. They took depositions, ran interrogatories, filed motions to exclude. And by the time the case reached trial, the plaintiff was operating on fumes, and the defense had turned every advantage into sandpaper. The strategy here was different. The strategy here was to give them a small, comprehensible win, to let them pay $10,000 and feel like they'd solved a problem, and when what they'd actually done was close a door on a room that didn't matter while leaving the room that mattered completely unguarded. "The product's liability case goes to trial," Eleanor said. It was not a question. "I don't want a settlement on that one," Serena said. "I want a jury." "You understand that a jury trial is more expensive, longer, higher risk." Serena's voice was even. "And a potential award multiple times larger than any settlement they'd offer. And I want the jury to hear about the suppressed reports. I want the jury to understand that Vantage knew about the defect and reclassified incident reports to avoid liability, and that Hayden manufactured a lift with a documented hydraulic fatigue issue and sold it to 16 warehouses in this region and settled the complaints quietly before they became public record." She paused. "I want the jury to be angry." Eleanor was quiet for a long time. The building's HVAC clicked on. A siren moved past on the street below, receded, disappeared. "There's another piece," Serena said. "The other 6 workers. I want to find them." She found them one by one. There was a particular methodology to finding people who didn't know they were part of the same story. You didn't start with the people. You started with the records, the OSHA variance logs, the workers' comp filings, all of the docket entries in the State Industrial Commission database, and you looked for the shape of the pattern before you went looking for the people it had happened to. If you approached the people first, with nothing but your own injury and a theory, you got doors closed and phone calls not returned. If you arrived having already confirmed that their name was in a document, that their incident had been categorized in a way that matched yours, that the work order from their facility had the same classification code and the same absence of follow-up inspection, then you were bringing them information instead of asking them for it, and the quality of the conversation was entirely different. Serena had learned this in her first life not from law, but from an older warehouse worker named Delphine, who had spent 30 years as a union steward and who had explained, over a lunch break one afternoon, that the most important thing you could bring another worker was evidence that they were not imagining it, that the system had a record of what it did to them, that it was written down somewhere in a document with a date and a code number, and that document could be found. Delphine had retired 6 months before the accident. Serena had never thought to call her in her first life, not because she didn't trust her, but because by the time she might have thought to, she was already in the settlement, already signing, already done. This time, she called Delphine on a Tuesday evening in September. "I remember you," Delphine said. "You were on the loading dock?" "Yes," Serena said. "You got hurt." "In March. My wrist." A pause. The sound of a television in the background turned low. "There were others," Serena said. "I think there were others, and I'm trying to find them. I know about the equipment issue. I have the service bulletin from Hayden. I have the maintenance work order from the New Jersey facility. I have—" "How did you get those?" Delphine said. And the quality of the question was not suspicious exactly, but evaluative. The question of someone who has spent 30 years learning the difference between a person doing their homework and a person claiming to have done it. "Records requests and court filings that are public documents," Serena said. "I have an attorney. Her name is Eleanor Marsh." A longer pause. "Eleanor Marsh," Delphine said slowly. "I know that name. She won the Kellerman case. 2019. Products Liability Manufacturing Plant in Trenton." "I remember Kellerman." Another pause. "What do you need from me?" "Names," Serena said. "Anyone you know who was on a claim, anyone who mentioned something being wrong with the equipment, anyone who signed a settlement and then went quiet." The list that Delphine gave her over the next 3 weeks was worth more than anything in the court records. Not the names themselves, though she had found or confirmed elsewhere, but the texture of information that came with them. The facility manager who had told Delphine privately that the lifts were being cycled too hard. So was the maintenance tech who had written up 3 work orders on one unit in a 6-month period and been told to stop submitting them so frequently because it looked bad in the audit. The HR coordinator who had processed Marcus Webb's reclassification and who had cried in the break room afterward and then said nothing because saying something required a calculation she was not in a position to make with her family's health insurance on the line. That HR coordinator's name was Dana Whitfield. She had left Vantage 8 months ago. She was now working as an office manager at a dental practice in the suburbs. Casey Park found her. She did not become a formal witness. Eleanor was cautious about witnesses whose own employment decisions created complexity, but she provided, through a channel that Eleanor managed with the careful neutrality of an attorney who understands the value of information that arrives without a clear attribution, 2 internal emails from the summer before Serena's accident, in which Richard Tanner had directed the facilities team to streamline the work order escalation process and reduce non-essential documentation of routine anomalies. Reduce non-essential documentation of routine anomalies. Serena read those words on a Wednesday evening in her kitchen with the yellow walls, and felt, not for the first time, the specific and cold clarity that comes from seeing a thing stated plainly. Not hidden, not carefully coded. Just stated in a company email by a man who believed the email would stay inside the company's system. That was the thing about documents. See, they had a way of becoming everyone's. She made herself a cup of coffee. She turned the page. Marcus Webb, 38, separated shoulder, accepted a settlement of $8,500 14 months ago and was currently working dispatch at a trucking company because he couldn't do warehouse work anymore. He lived in a 2-bedroom apartment with his daughter and an old beagle named Chicken. He was suspicious of Serena when she first called, and she had expected that. She had been suspicious, too, in her first life of anyone who seemed to be offering something. The architecture of that suspicion was familiar to her. She knew how to wait inside it. She called him 4 times over 3 weeks. She didn't push. Yes, she answered his questions factually, and then she asked him one question at the end of the 4th call that changed the tenor of everything. "Did they tell you," she said, "that your incident had been reported to OSHA as a different type of injury than what was in the original company report?" Silence on the line. "They changed your report too?" she said quietly. 4 days after, same timeline as mine. I have the documents. He said he'd call her back. He called back 2 hours later. Diane Castellano, 44, fractured 2 metacarpals in her right hand, accepted $11,000, had recurring nerve pain that had not been anticipated in the settlement, and could not now be included because she'd signed the release. She cried on the phone the first time Serena spoke to her. Oh, not out of grief exactly, but out of the particular release that comes from learning you were not alone in being deceived. That someone else had been through the same machine and had also emerged with the faint impression of its gears on their skin. Kevin Osei, 51, Robert Tanaka, 29, Priya Shetty, 34, Luz Garza, 47. And then through Luz Garza's neighbor who had worked at a different Vantage facility in Columbus, Ohio. 9 more. 15 plaintiffs total. 15 suppressed reclassifications, 15 individual workers' comp settlements that had closed individual claims while the underlying product defect remained active and unremedied in warehouses across the region. Eleanor Marsh filed the product's liability action in federal court on a Friday afternoon in October, almost captioned as a multi-plaintiff tort against Hayden Industrial Systems, with Vantage Medical Supply Corporation named as co-defendant under a theory of negligent procurement, specifically that Vantage had continued to purchase and operate Hayden's Model 770 hydraulic platform lifts after receiving internal service notifications in 2019 and 2021, indicating progressive hydraulic seal degradation under heavy load cycling. The filing did not generate a press release. It did not generate any coverage. It went into the federal docket as case number 23-CV-4819 and sat there, quiet and unnoticed, while Serena went to work at the job she'd found, a data entry position at a small insurance brokerage that paid $32 an hour and required her to sit at a desk all day, which her wrist could manage, and paid her rent and ate her lunches out of a container she brought from home and waited. Vantage's legal team identified the filing 18 days later. She knew the moment they found it because Derek Paulson called her workers' comp attorney, a man named Alan Breck, who handled her workers' comp claim on a flat fee because that was the other piece of the strategy, keeping the workers' comp case visibly underfunded so the opposition believed they were dealing with someone who didn't have resources, and requested an urgent settlement conference. Alan Breck called Serena to relay the request. "They want to move fast," he said. "I know," she said. "They're offering to increase the settlement to $15,000. I'll take 10. A pause. Alan Breck was a decent man in the mold of decent men who had operated inside systems long enough to find their size within them. He was not naive, but he was also not entirely sure what Serena was doing because she had not told him, and the fact that she had not told him was intentional. He knew about the product's liability case in the abstract. She had disclosed its existence as required, but she had not walked him through the architecture of it, the way the two cases interlocked, the specific release language she needed the workers' comp settlement to contain or not contain. Eleanor Marsh knew. Eleanor Marsh had reviewed the workers' comp release language in advance and flagged the one paragraph that required amendment. And Serena had quietly ensured that Alan Breck knew to accept that specific language as drafted and to resist any additions from Paulson's team without being told why. "You want to take less than they're offering," Alan said. "I want to close this," Serena said. 10,000, the settlement I already reviewed, no modifications. Alan processed this. "They'll want to add a broader release," he said. "They always do. Paulson will push for an all-claims release." Let him push, she said. If he adds language releasing third-party products liability claims, I'll walk. And if he doesn't, then I'll sign. There was a pause. Serena, Alan said, is there something else going on here? She considered the question. It was a fair question from a man who was nominally her attorney and who had the right to understand the cases he was involved in. There's always something else going on, she said. Derek Paulson pushed for the broader release. Of course he did. She had expected it. She had planned for it. He sent revised settlement language to Alan Breck that included a clause releasing Vantage Medical Supply Corporation and any affiliates, predecessors, successors, and related entities from all known and unknown claims arising from or related to the plaintiff's employment and any incidents occurring during the course of said employment. Serena read the language and felt a very small, cold pleasure. The language was almost right. It was the kind of language a good corporate defense attorney drafts when he believes he is being thorough. It covered Vantage's affiliates and related entities. It covered known and unknown claims. It had the architecture of completeness. What it did not have, because Derek Paulson had not been told to include it, because no one had told him there was a products liability case filed against a separate defendant, because the filing was sitting in federal court under a caption that named Hayden Industrial Systems First was a specific release of third-party tort claims. The language covered claims arising from or related to the plaintiff's employment. The products liability case was not framed as arising from her employment. It was framed as a personal injury action arising from a defective product, with the injury predating the claim by the standard statute of limitations calculation. A subtle distinction, a precise one. She sent the proposed language to Eleanor Marsh, who read it for 11 minutes and then called back. It's defensible, Eleanor said. Her voice had the quality of a person who was choosing words carefully. It's not certain. If they argue the claim arises from the employment relationship, they can move to enforce the release against the product's liability action. And if they do, we'd litigate the scope of the release. It would take time and money. We'd probably win on the third-party defendant angle since Hayden isn't named in the release at all. The Vantage co-defendant angle is weaker. Serena was quiet. How much weaker? 60-40 in our favor. Maybe 65-35 with the right judge. Who's assigned to the federal case? Judge Patricia Hale. Serena had looked up Judge Patricia Hale during her 6 weeks of research. Hale had been a plaintiff's attorney before she was appointed to the bench. Her written opinions in tort cases were meticulous and showed a consistent pattern of skepticism toward broad release interpretations that stripped plaintiffs of rights they hadn't clearly intended to waive. Request oral argument on any release scope motion, Serena said. Make sure we're in front of Hale. I know how to practice law, Eleanor said, but not unkindly. I know you do, Serena said. I'm just being thorough. Yes, Eleanor said. You are. She rejected Paulson's broader release language. Alan Breck relayed the rejection with the slightly apologetic tone of a man conveying a message he doesn't fully understand. He told Paulson's associate that his client found the additional language unnecessary and was willing to close at the original terms. There was a 24-hour silence. During that silence, Serena went to work. She processed insurance documents. She ate a sandwich at her desk. She took the bus home because the bus was $2.40, and she was still rationing, still building her savings into something that would carry her through a trial. She stopped at the corner store for coffee in a paper cup that tasted like it had been brewed in a different decade, and walked the remaining 4 blocks to her apartment. The coffee was terrible. She drank it looking out her window at the street below, which was wet from an early evening rain that had moved through while she was at the office. The street had that particular sheen, the wet pavement reflecting the streetlight in a long, distorted streak, and she stood at the window and held the cup with both hands and thought about nothing for several minutes, which was a skill she had developed, the ability to be empty, to wait without filling the waiting with anxiety. She had lost that in her first life. In her first life, the waiting had been full of spiraling calculations. How long the money would last, whether the wrist would heal correctly, whether the adjuster would deny her follow-up claim, whether her landlord had noticed she'd paid rent 2 days late. The waiting had been its own form of constant labor. Now she waited in silence and drank her bad coffee and watched the street shine. Paulson's team responded the next morning. They accepted the original terms. $10,000. Standard workers' comp release. No broader language. The settlement conference was held at the mediation firm on the faculty 14th floor of a building downtown. The building had an elevator that made a faint grinding sound on the way up, and the carpet in the hallway was a particular shade of blue-green that had probably looked professional when it was installed and now looked like the bottom of an aquarium. A ficus near the elevator. A yellow ribbon, faded. She had been in this building before. She had a memory of it that was both entirely personal and entirely strange. The memory of a day that had not happened yet in the timeline she was currently inhabiting. And the sensation of moving through that memory in the present tense was something she had learned not to examine too closely. It had the quality of a dream you remember mid-afternoon, slightly wrong at the edges. Patricia Engel had the same voice. Derek Paulson had the same watch. She sat down. She accepted the document. She read through it slowly, taking the full time she was entitled to, and she noted with precise satisfaction that the release language was exactly as negotiated, covering the March 12th incident, releasing Vantage Medical Supply Corporation under the workers' comp and general negligence theories, no reference to Hayden Industrial Systems, no reference to third-party products liability, no reference to the class of claims that was currently sitting in federal court 63 blocks away. She signed. Oh, the pen smelled like synthetic rubber. She signed her name, neat and unhurried, and she stood, and she walked to the elevator, and she did not smile until the doors were fully closed. In the elevator, going down, she took out her phone and sent a single text to Eleanor Marsh. It read, "It's done. We go to trial." Eleanor's reply came back in 40 seconds. "Good. Discovery Conference is scheduled for the 19th. The month between the settlement and the trial was not, from the outside, dramatic. From the outside, it looked like the ordinary slow procedure of federal civil litigation. Discovery filings, interrogatories, expert witness disclosures, the gradual assembly of a record that would eventually walk into a courtroom and ask 12 strangers to render a verdict on a defective hydraulic lift, and the human cost of suppressed paperwork. From the inside, it was the month Serena Voss stopped being someone things happened to. She had been, for most of her first life, someone things happened to. She had been an object in other people's plans, in Vantage's risk management calculus, in the insurance adjuster's claim matrix, in Derek Paulson's quarterly caseload. She had existed in other people's strategies as a variable to be managed, a number to be minimized, a problem to be settled. And she had allowed this, not from weakness exactly, but from a species of exhaustion that precedes clarity. The exhaustion of not knowing what you don't know. Now she knew. She worked the discovery phase with Eleanor's team as a quasi-paralegal in everything but title. She had no formal role, but Eleanor's associate, a young woman named Casey Park who had the focused, slightly frantic energy of someone 3 years out of law school and determined to become something, accepted Serena's involvement with the pragmatic appreciation of someone who recognized research capacity when she saw it. It was Serena who found the third suppressed report. It was buried in Vantage's document production. 2,300 pages of internal communications, maintenance logs, vendor contracts, and HR files that arrived in 11 Redweld folders and were immediately allocated across Casey Park's desk, the conference room table, and 3 banker's boxes in Eleanor's office. The kind of production designed to overwhelm through volume. The report was on page 847. It was a maintenance work order from a Vantage facility in New Jersey, dated 8 months before Serena's accident, documenting an anomalous pressure drop in the hydraulic system of a Model 770 lift, the same model, during a routine load test. The work order had been processed internally. It had not been escalated to Hayden. It had not been reported to OSHA. It had been filed under the maintenance category Non-Critical Anomaly Monitoring, and followed up with a note that read, "System returned to service. Will monitor." The note was initialed by someone whose initials were RT. It took Serena 40 minutes to identify RT as Richard Tanner, Vantage's regional facilities manager for the Northeastern Corridor, the man who had signed off on the equipment operating schedule that put the Model 770 lifts into 3-shift rotation at 4 facilities, including the one where Serena worked. Then she brought the work order to Eleanor at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday with a sticky note on top that read, "This is the negligent procurement angle." They knew. Eleanor read it. She looked up. "This changes the damages calculation," she said. "Punitive damages," Serena said. "They didn't just fail to investigate a defect. They investigated it, documented it, and put the equipment back in service without repair or notification. That's not negligence, that's a decision." Eleanor was quiet. "Juries," she said, "respond to decisions." The trial was scheduled to begin on the 15th of the following month. Hayden Industrial Systems settled 2 weeks before trial. Their attorneys contacted Eleanor with an offer that climbed from $200,000 to $450,000 over the course of 3 negotiating sessions. Ong and Eleanor presented each offer to the collective group of plaintiffs with the even-handed precision of someone who understood that her job was not to make decisions, but to ensure that the people making them had complete information. The group voted to reject the settlement and go to trial. Not because $450,000 divided 15 ways was nothing. It was not nothing. It was $30,000 per plaintiff on average, which was real money to real people with real consequences still reverberating from injuries that had happened years ago. Marcus Webb's daughter was applying to colleges. Luz Garza's nerve damage had required 2 surgeries. Priya Shetty had lost partial grip strength in her dominant hand and retrained for a different career on her own time, her own dime, after a settlement that did not contemplate any of that. They voted to reject it because Serena stood in Eleanor Marsh's conference room on a Wednesday night and explained, with the precision of someone who had spent 14 months learning the architecture of products liability law, exactly what the jury would hear. "They will hear," she said, "that Hayden designed a hydraulic platform lift with a known fatigue threshold in the secondary ceiling component. They'll hear that Hayden was aware of this threshold by 2019 at the latest because of a service bulletin they issued to distributors that Vantage received and did not act on. They'll hear that Vantage not only failed to act on that bulletin, they put the equipment into expanded service rotation 8 months later, while increasing load cycles and therefore accelerating the exact failure mode Hayden had warned about." She paused. "And then they'll hear about the maintenance work order from New Jersey. They'll hear that someone at Vantage documented an anomalous pressure drop, noted it, and signed off on returning the equipment to service. And they'll hear that 7 months later, Marcus fractured his shoulder. And 2 months after that, I fractured my wrist. And that both of us were handed revised incident reports that shifted the blame to us." The room was quiet. "The jury," she said, "will be angry." The trial lasted 11 days. The first day was procedural. The second day was the kind of day that looks, from the outside, like nothing is happening. Voir dire, preliminary motions, the slow establishment of ground rules, but which Serena watched with the close attention of someone who knew that voir dire was often where trials were actually won or lost in the invisible sorting process that determined which 12 strangers would sit in the box and hear what she and Eleanor had spent 14 months building. Eleanor's jury consultant was a woman named Dr. Ewan, who sat beside Casey Park in the gallery and took notes in a small leather journal. Serena had read Dr. Ewan's academic work. She had an article on occupational bias in civil trial juries that Serena had found useful, and understood, in the abstract, what the consultant was looking for. People who could hold complexity without resolving it too quickly. People who understood institutional decision-making. People who had, in their own lives, also encountered the gap between what an organization said and what it did. The jury that was seated included a retired teacher, a small business owner who had worked in facilities management before starting her own company, a nurse practitioner, a logistics coordinator at a freight company who had to be questioned carefully about potential familiarity with the industry, a data analyst, 2 retirees, and 5 others whose biographies Serena had reviewed in the voir dire transcripts and whose presence she had approved with the particular confidence of someone doing a calculation they had checked from multiple angles. The logistics coordinator worried Eleanor slightly. Potential industry sympathy. Serena was not worried about the logistics coordinator. She had looked at the voir dire transcript carefully and found, in the coordinator's responses to questions about workplace safety, a specific pattern of language. The word protocol, used 3 times, always in the context of what should happen when protocol is not followed. That suggested someone who believed in systems and was troubled by people who subverted them. The logistics coordinator was going to be very interested in the Dana Whitfield emails. She turned out to be right. Priya Shetty testified on day 5. She had not wanted to testify. She had told Serena this on the phone 3 weeks before trial, not as a refusal but as a disclosure, the way someone admits to a difficulty they are prepared to work through if they must. She had a job now, a new career. People at her new company didn't know about the injury, didn't know about Vantage. She had spent 8 months carefully not bringing the past into the present. "You don't have to," Serena had said. A pause. "What would my testimony add?" "You can speak to the impact," Serena said. "The jury will hear about the defect and the suppressed reports from our expert and from the documents. What the expert can't tell them is what it felt like to retrain for an entire career because your hand didn't heal the way the original treatment assumed it would. The economic loss model we filed estimates your career disruption at a specific dollar figure. The jury will hear the number, but they'll understand it differently if they hear you describe what it actually cost." Silence on the line. "I mean in terms of time," Serena added, "in terms of what you did differently, and in terms of what you chose because other options had closed." Another pause. Longer. "I'll testify," Priya said. She was a composed witness. She had the quality of someone who had processed the experience sufficiently to speak about it without the processing interrupting the speech. She answered Eleanor's questions directly. She did not perform distress. She described, with the matter-of-fact precision of someone who had genuinely thought the thing through, the sequence of decisions she had made after it became clear that her dominant hand was not going to fully recover. The occupational therapy, the job that didn't require fine motor work, the certification she'd started at night because the day job didn't cover her bills, the 2 years of simultaneous employment and study that she could not describe as anything other than what it was. "Would you have pursued the certification otherwise?" Eleanor asked. "I don't know," Priya said. "Maybe eventually. I liked the work I was doing before. I was good at it. I probably would have stayed." "Were you good at data analysis?" A pause. "Yes," Priya said. "Did you know that before you were injured?" A longer pause. Something moved across Priya's face that Serena could see from the 3rd row. Not grief, not quite, but the specific expression of someone acknowledging an irony too complicated to unpack in a sentence. "No," Priya said. "Not until I had to find out." In the gallery, the logistics coordinator was writing in her notepad. Luz Garza testified on day 7. She testified through an interpreter, which had been a point of contention in a pre-trial motion from Hayden's counsel, arguing that her English proficiency, documented in her employment record, made an interpreter unnecessary. Judge Hale had denied the motion and allowed the interpreter on the grounds that a witness is entitled to testify in the language in which they are most comfortable when their testimony includes the description of medical and legal concepts. Luz Garza's testimony about her 2 surgeries, given in Spanish and translated by a court-certified interpreter whose voice ran a half-second behind hers like a quiet echo, had a quality of doubled precision. The original words and their rendering, both careful, both patient, the room very still around them. Hayden's attorney cross-examined her for 27 minutes. He did not make progress. As the jury was watching Luz Garza the way people watch something they don't want to look away from. Not for the drama, but for the specificity. The particular specificity of a person describing her own body, what it had done before, what it could do now, what she had adapted, and what she had lost, and what she had decided, finally, to stop grieving because grief is not a form of currency either, and you eventually have to turn it into something you can carry. She didn't say that last part, but it was in the quality of her stillness in the witness box, in the way she turned to face the jury when Eleanor asked her to, in the steadiness with which she looked at 12 strangers and told them what 3 years had looked like. Serena watched from the 3rd row. She pressed the tip of her pen to the legal pad and did not write anything. It was not. Always from the gallery, particularly cinematic. Federal civil trials rarely are. There were no dramatic revelations, no surprise witnesses, no moments where the gallery erupted and the judge had to call for order. What there was, instead, was the slow, methodical construction of a picture. The picture of a company that had received information, processed it, noted it, and decided that the cost of acting on it exceeded the cost of staying quiet. Eleanor Marsh was not a theatrical attorney. She did not work the room, she did not lean on the jury rail or gesture broadly or let her voice rise into the register that signals the audience to feel something. She worked through documents. She walked witnesses through timelines. She established, with the careful patience of someone laying stones in an arch, was each piece of the factual record until the arch could support its own weight and stand without her hands on it. The RT work order was entered into evidence on day 4. Richard Tanner testified on day 6. He was a compact man in his late 50s with the slightly compressed quality of a person who had spent decades managing not to be noticed, and he sat in the witness box with the careful stillness of someone who had been prepared by attorneys to give exactly as much information as the question required, and no more. Eleanor did not attack him. She asked him calmly and with complete specificity about the maintenance work order. She asked him to read the note aloud. She asked him to confirm his initials. She asked him, in the same even tone she used for everything, what non-critical anomaly monitoring meant in practice. And what he said it meant the issue would be tracked. She asked how it had been tracked. He said through the standard maintenance schedule. She asked him to describe the standard maintenance schedule for the Model 770 lifts. He described it. She asked him then to review the actual maintenance logs from the 4 facilities where the lifts were operating during the period in question. The logs showed no follow-up inspections. Not one. The non-critical anomaly monitoring had generated a file notation and nothing else. So when you wrote "will monitor," Eleanor said, in exactly the same tone she had used for every other question, you mean that a note was made in a file. Tanner's attorney objected. The objection was overruled. The note was made in the file, Tanner said. And the equipment was returned to service. Yes. And remained in service for the next 7 months. Yes. Until the first of the injuries in this case. I would have to confirm the dates. The dates are in the exhibit in front of you, Eleanor said. Take your time. He looked at the exhibit for approximately 10 seconds. Yes, he said. Thank you, Eleanor said and turned away. Serena was sitting in the gallery, 3rd row. She was wearing a gray dress that cost $42 from a discount retailer, and she had her leather folder on her lap, and she was taking notes in the same small, precise handwriting she had used to document the case from the beginning. Not because she needed to take notes, but because it gave her hands something to do, and because the act of writing required a certain quality of attention that she found useful for keeping the rest of herself still. She watched Richard Tanner step down from the witness box. She wrote, in her notebook, credibility, none remaining. The closing arguments were on day 10. Hayden's attorney went first and argued, with practiced fluency, that the company had acted responsibly within industry standards, and that the injuries were the result of misuse by the employer rather than defect in the product. He was good. He was prepared and articulate, and he made the case sound reasonable, which was his job. Vantage's attorney made a similar argument and added an emphasis on contributory factors and the shared responsibility of workplace safety training. Eleanor Marsh closed last. She walked to the front of the courtroom. She did not look at her notes. She had the easy, grounded presence of someone who had prepared so thoroughly that preparation had become posture. 15 people, she said. 15 people across 4 facilities over a period of 3 years. 15 people who loaded trucks and moved freight and operated heavy equipment and did not, on any of those mornings when they went to work, plan for what happened to them. She paused. That's not a pattern. 15 is not a pattern statistically. What 15 is, in this room, is a record. She walked the jury through it in the order she had established it. The Hayden Service Bulletin, the Vantage Receipt, and non-action, the maintenance work order from New Jersey, the RT initials, the decision to return to service. Under the injuries, the reclassified reports. They changed those reports, she said. Not because there was new information, not because the initial reports were wrong. They changed them because the initial reports were correct, and a correct report created liability, and a reclassified report shifted that liability onto the workers who were already injured, onto people who were already in pain, already navigating workers' comp claims, already trying to figure out how to pay rent while they healed. Her voice was even, not theatrical, just even. That is a decision. That is not negligence. That is a specific, deliberate decision made by people who knew what they were doing and calculated that it was worth doing. She stopped. I'm asking you to tell them what it was worth. The jury deliberated for 2 days and 7 hours. They came back on a Friday afternoon. Serena was in the courthouse cafe when Casey Park called her. The cafe had plastic chairs and a coffee machine that produced a dark, slightly bitter output in a paper cup that tasted almost exactly like the corner store coffee she'd been drinking all year. She was on her second cup. She had eaten a cheese sandwich and read 11 pages of a novel she was carrying and had checked her phone 40 times in the course of an hour before she made herself put it face down and read instead. It rang face down. She let it ring twice. Then she picked it up. They're back, Casey said. Serena put down the cup, picked up her folder, and walked to the elevator. The jury awarded compensatory damages of $1,200,000. Divided among the 15 plaintiffs according to the severity and documented impact of their individual injuries. They awarded punitive damages of $1,800,000 to be split as the court directed, in direct response to, and they had written this in the verdict form, which Eleanor Marsh told Serena later was unusual and reflected the jury's specific intent to record their reasoning, the deliberate reclassification of incident reports following knowledge of the product defect. $3 million in total. The forewoman was a woman in her late 40s with reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck. She read the verdict in a clear, even voice, the voice of someone who had thought about this and was not uncertain about what she'd concluded. She did not look at the defense table. She looked at the judge. Serena was sitting in the gallery, third row, when the foreperson read the verdict. She did not move. Around her, the room shifted and breathed. She heard Marcus inhale sharply, a quick, controlled sound. She heard Luce make a small sound she couldn't classify. She heard Priya, beside her in the row, press her hand flat against her thigh, a grounding gesture, and then exhale very slowly. She did not look at Paulson, who was at the defense table with an expression that she recognized from a meeting in her first life. The expression of a man recalculating a situation he had been certain he had control of. She did not look at Richard Tanner, who was in the gallery on the other side, and whose face she found she had no interest in examining. She did not look at the other 14 plaintiffs, some of whom were crying, and some of whom were gripping each other's hands, some of whom had the specific stillness of people absorbing information too large to immediately contain. She looked at her notebook. She had written, at the bottom of the last page, under the last set of notes from the trial, a single line. She had written it 2 weeks ago, in the middle of the night, when she had woken at 3 a.m., in the apartment with the yellow walls and lain in the dark, turning the whole structure over one more time, checking the joints, verifying the load-bearing elements. The line read, "They thought we needed the $10,000. That's the only miscalculation that mattered." The judge thanked the jury. The room began the particular slow dissolution of a formal proceeding that has concluded. Attorneys gathered papers. Oh, the courtroom deputy moved the way courtroom deputies move, with the unhurried authority of someone managing a transition that has happened 10,000 times in this room. Serena did not move immediately. She sat for a moment with the notebook on her lap and the legal pad and the pen she had been pressing to the page without writing anything, and she let the room empty slightly around her. Not from ceremony, not because the moment required solemnity. She stayed still because she was finishing a thought. She was thinking about the woman she had been in her first life, sitting in an apartment with yellow walls that she had chosen because the paint was cheap, signing a document that traded away something she didn't know she had, saying thank you to a man whose watch cost more than her monthly rent. That woman had not been stupid. She had not been naive in the way people use the word to mean culpable. She had been working with incomplete information inside a system designed to limit how much information she could acquire, and she had done the best calculation she could with what she had. She had just not had enough. Now she did. She closed the notebook. She stood. She put the notebook and the legal pad and the pen in her leather folder and closed the clasp. Priya was looking at her. "How did you know?" Priya said. It was a quiet question. Not challenging, genuinely curious, in the way of someone who has been watching a thing unfold for 14 months and has the patience now to ask the question directly. Serena considered this. "I didn't know," she said. "I had enough information to make the calculation. Only that's different from knowing." Priya was quiet for a moment. "Is it?" she said. Serena picked up her folder. "Come on," she said. "Eleanor will want to debrief." She found Eleanor Marsh outside the courthouse. Eleanor was standing on the steps in a gray coat with her phone to her ear, finishing a conversation. She finished it and looked at Serena. "Post-trial motions in 4 weeks," Eleanor said. "They'll try to reduce the punitive award. Standard practice." "Let them try," Serena said. "They'll probably get it reduced somewhat. The ratio of punitive to compensatory is aggressive. Judges are cautious about ratios above 1-to-1. And below 1-to-1? Possible. Still a significant award even at a 1-to-1 ratio." "What's our compensatory share?" Eleanor calculated. "Got your individual award is 142,000 compensatory based on the allocation the jury specified, plus your pro rata share of the punitive award after any reduction. Conservatively, somewhere between $200,000 and $250,000. Serena nodded. That was the number. That was the real number, her personal number, after the 15-way distribution and the anticipated post-trial reduction and Eleanor's contingency fee. $200,000 approximately, maybe $220,000, not $3 million. The $3 million was the group's number, the number that named the scale of what had been done, the number that would appear in the headline if anyone wrote about it, and in the verdict that would now be public record. Her number was 200,000. Should 200,000 compared to 10,000? It was enough. It was more than enough. It was what she needed it to be. She started down the courthouse steps. Behind her, Eleanor said, "You should know that Paulson is already talking about appeal." Serena stopped on the third step. She did not turn around. "Tell him to take his time," she said. She took the bus home. The city moved past the windows in its ordinary way. Storefronts, intersections, pedestrians with their collars turned up against the October cold, a man eating a gyro from a foil wrapper while waiting for a crosswalk signal. The light at 4 in the afternoon had that particular quality it gets in autumn in the Northeast, low and slightly gold, the kind of light that lands on ordinary things and makes them look like they're being remembered rather than seen for the first time. She sat in a middle seat with her leather folder on her lap and watched the city go by. She thought about Marcus Webb's daughter applying to colleges. She thought about Luz Garza's 2 surgeries. She thought about Priya Shetty, who had called her 3 weeks ago to say that she had finished the data analytics certification she'd been working on for 2 years and had just been offered a position at a firm downtown, and that she had started the certification 6 months after her injury because she had run out of other options and had discovered, to her considerable surprise, that she was excellent at it. "I think I was always good at this," Priya had said on the phone. I just never had to find out." "No," Serena had said. "We usually don't." The bus stopped. She got off 2 blocks from the corner store. She stopped in, bought a coffee in a paper cup. The man behind the counter, a man she had bought coffee from for over a year who knew her order but had never learned her name, which was a particular species of urban relationship that she found oddly comforting, nodded at her and handed her the cup and took her $2.20 without ceremony. She walked the 2 blocks to her building. The yellow walls were waiting. She was going to paint them. Not immediately, not next week, but she had made the decision sometime in the last month, in the peripheral way she sometimes made decisions, without a specific moment of deliberation. She had looked at the yellow walls one morning and felt, for the first time in the year, she had spent in this apartment working the case, completely neutral about them. Not annoyed, not tired of them, just ready to change them. She had been looking at paint samples on her phone in spare moments. Soft white, a particular gray blue, something called warm stone that was probably neither warm nor particularly stony, but photographed well in the samples. She set her coffee on the kitchen counter. She took off her gray dress. She hung it up because she was going to need it to be clean for the post-trial period, when there would be more meetings, more filings, more appearances that required her to look like a person in possession of a plan. She was a person in possession of a plan. She put on old clothes, soft pants, only a sweater that had a small hole at the left cuff that she had been meaning to repair for months. She picked up her coffee. She stood in the kitchen with her coffee and her holey sweater, and she looked at the yellow walls. Then she picked up her phone and called Casey Park. Casey answered on the second ring. "We need Tanner's deposition transcript," Serena said. specifically the section where he explained the maintenance categorization system. If they try to reduce the punitive award on the grounds that the decision was within industry standards, I want to walk Judge Hale through the 4 specific occasions where industry standards, as defined by Hayden's own service documentation, would have required escalation, and Vantage's own categorization system was used to avoid triggering them. A pause. I'll have it to you by morning, Casey said. Thank you, Serena said. She hung up. She drank her coffee. Outside the window, the city was going dark, the way cities do in October. Quickly and without ceremony. The streetlight came on. The wet pavement from a shower she hadn't noticed reflected it in a long, wavering line. She reached for a notepad on the counter. She wrote, in her small, precise handwriting, 3-page numbers from the Tanner deposition she had memorized. She wrote, next to the 3rd page number, a single word, escalation. Then she put the pen down and finished her coffee. The post-trial motions proceeded over the following 6 weeks. Hayden's attorneys moved to reduce the punitive award on 3 grounds: that the ratio was excessive under the applicable constitutional standard, that the jury had been improperly influenced by evidence that should have been excluded under a motion Hayden's counsel had filed pre-trial and which Judge Hale had denied, and that the calculation of compensatory damages had included speculative future damages that were not adequately supported by the evidentiary record. Judge Hale's clerks worked through the motions with the methodical patience of people in a system designed to be slow on purpose. Serena filed a friend of the court brief, technically filed by a workers' rights nonprofit that Eleanor had contacted, but researched and substantially drafted by Serena. Which was a thing she had now done twice, and which had not been legally unusual since non-attorneys draft such briefs routinely, that addressed the constitutional ratio question by cataloging 23 comparable verdicts in products liability cases involving suppressed safety documentation and calculating the median ratio of punitive to compensatory in those cases. The median was 1.6 to 1. The jury in their case had awarded approximately 1.5 to 1. Judge Hale reviewed the brief. She denied the motions to reduce. The verdict stood. The checks arrived on a Thursday. Serena was at work when Alan Breck's assistant called to tell her the check had been received at the firm and was available for pickup. She thanked the assistant and noted the time and said she would come by on her lunch break. She went by on her lunch break. Alan's office was 3 blocks from the insurance brokerage. She walked in, signed for the check, accepted it in a plain envelope that Alan handed her with a slightly odd expression that he quickly arranged into professional neutrality. "Congratulations," he said. "Thank you for your help," she said, and she meant it. Alan had not known the full strategy, but he had executed his part of it well and had held the line on the release language under pressure and had done exactly what a decent lawyer is paid to do. She walked back to the office, she ate the lunch she'd brought, rice and leftover chicken in a container with a lid that didn't quite fit right and leaked slightly at one corner. She ate it at her desk and looked at the envelope and felt not triumph, but something calmer and more complete. Oh, the particular satisfaction of a structure that has held its weight. She finished lunch. She put the container back in her bag. She opened the envelope. The check was for $216,000. Her name was on it, spelled correctly, which she had specifically verified with Eleanor's billing department because in her first life the name on the $10,000 check had been misspelled. Sarah instead of Serena. And she had spent 2 days getting it corrected and had laughed at the time, a slightly hysterical laugh. The laugh of someone for whom even a small administrative error carries the weight of a larger pattern. Now she looked at the correctly spelled name. She folded the check and put it back in the envelope and put the envelope in her leather folder. Well, she had an appointment at 2 p.m. with a financial advisor Eleanor had recommended. Not a flashy financial advisor, not the kind with an office full of abstract art and a receptionist whose job was to make clients feel like they'd arrived somewhere exclusive. A straightforward fee-only advisor with a practice focused on first-generation wealth clients, which was a category that included people who had come into a significant sum unexpectedly and needed someone to help them not lose it. She had a list of questions she had written out the night before. She had been writing the list for 2 weeks, adding to it as things occurred to her. Tax treatment of settlement proceeds, the exclusion for physical injury recoveries, Under 26 U.S.C. Section 104, the allocation between compensatory and punitive for tax purposes, index fund structures, emergency reserve calculation, whether there was a mathematical argument for carrying her current apartment lease through the year, or whether the numbers supported an upgrade. She had been thinking about the paint colors again, the warm stone, the gray-blue. The first thing she had done after waking in the apartment was find a lawyer. But before that, in the 4 days between waking up in the apartment with the yellow walls and making the first call to the Bar Association, she had done something she had not done in her first life. She had sat with the fact of what had happened to her. Not the accident, not the settlement, the entire span of it. She sat with it at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee at 6 in the morning, and she let herself understand the full shape of it. Not just the injury, and the money, and the loss, but the particular deformation of character that had been operating quietly for years before the accident, the one that made her reflexively minimize her own claims, accept what was offered, say thank you when thank you was not warranted. She did not spend a long time on this. She was not a person who spent long times on things when there was work to do, but she spent exactly enough time. She sat until the coffee was gone and the light had shifted in the windows, and she thought, I know what this is. I know what was done. I know what can be done instead. Then she got up, washed the cup, and started making a list. The list was 3 pages long by the time she was done, organized in columns. Documents needed, people to identify, legal questions to research, my timelines, and at the top of page 1, she had written a single line that was not a legal note or a strategic item, but a kind of orientation. It read, "You are not asking for permission." She closed the envelope and put it away. She had 45 minutes before she needed to leave for the 2 p.m. She opened her laptop and went back to work. She did not see Derek Paulson again for 6 weeks, and then only by accident. She was in a coffee shop, a real coffee shop, not the corner store, a place with espresso machines and wooden furniture, and the particular ambient sound of a space filled with people working alone together, when he walked in with 2 other attorneys in suits that had the deliberate casualness of expensive clothing worn by people who don't need to try. He was talking. He didn't notice her. She was sitting at a table near the window with a cup of actual espresso. A flat white, which she had decided was a reasonable recurring expense now that her financial picture had changed in a concrete and documented way. And her laptop, working through a document that Eleanor's office had sent over relating to the appeal that Hayden had finally, and with considerable expenditure of everyone's time, decided to file. She watched Paulson order. She watched him laugh at something one of the other attorneys said. She watched him receive his coffee and turn and move toward a table in the back without looking at her. She looked back at her screen. Then she looked at him one more time. He didn't know. That was the part she was sitting with, quietly. He didn't know that the $10,000 settlement had been the hinge point. But he didn't know that she had engineered his confidence as a deliberate instrument. He didn't know that the specific words he had not included in the release agreement, the third-party product's liability language, the Hayden reference, the explicit bar, were absent not by oversight, but because she had managed the information he had available to him with the same precision he had once used to manage hers. He would figure some of it out eventually. When the appeal was adjudicated, when someone on his team went back through the timeline and saw how the 2 filings had related to each other, he would figure out that the workers' comp case had been filed first and settled first, and that the product's liability case had been filed before the settlement and was already running when he sat across the table in the mediator's office and accepted the original release language. He would figure out that he had been played. She did not know exactly what that moment would look like for him. She found she was not particularly curious about it. She looked back at her screen. She highlighted a paragraph in the Hayden appeal brief and typed a note in the margin. Consider whether the trial court's discretion in admitting the New Jersey maintenance log is distinguishable from the cases cited here. Different factual predicate for unfair prejudice argument. She sent the note to Casey Park. Then she finished her flat white, closed her laptop, put on her coat, and walked out into the afternoon. And as the light was doing its October thing again. Low and gold and slightly unreal. She had a viewing appointment at 4 p.m. for a 1-bedroom in a building 12 blocks north. A building with large windows and good natural light and paint on the walls that was not yellow. She started walking. The city came toward her in its ordinary, indifferent way. Storefronts, intersections, a man walking a dog who pulled ahead on the leash with the purposeful urgency of a dog who believes the next block will contain something magnificent. And she moved through it with her hands in her pockets and her leather folder under her arm. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Marcus Webb. It read, simply, "First day of classes. She started today." She read it. She stopped walking for a moment at a crosswalk while the light was red. She typed back, "Tell her good luck." The light changed. She crossed. Eleanor Marsh's office called 2 days later with news about the appeal schedule. Then Casey Park called about a related inquiry from a journalist covering workplace safety in the logistics sector who had found the federal verdict through public court records and wanted to speak with plaintiffs willing to share their stories. Then Priya Shetty texted to say she'd been promoted. 3 months in, already promoted, and included 3 exclamation points that Serena read with something she identified, with a slight internal surprise, as genuine warmth. She was sitting in her new apartment when Priya's text came through. The apartment was not dramatically different from the old one. Same city, slightly larger windows, better light. And the walls were painted a color called morning linen, which was essentially the warm stone option she had been looking at on her phone. A soft, creamy off-white that changed quality throughout the day, catching the morning light in a pale gold and settling in the evenings into something quieter. She had painted them herself, Saturday and Sunday, over the course of one weekend, with a roller she bought at the hardware store and 3 cans of paint, and the physical satisfaction of covering something old with something chosen. She texted Priya back. She set her phone on the windowsill. She was at the kitchen table with the Hayden appeal brief and a yellow legal pad and a cup of coffee that came from a machine she had purchased because $216,000 was, among other things, a coffee machine. And yes, the machine was not expensive. It was a reliable mid-tier espresso machine that made a flat white with approximately 80% of the quality of the coffee shop version at a fraction of the cost, which was the kind of calculation she still made automatically, had made her whole life, and which she suspected she would always make, regardless of the number. The brief needed annotations. She had 8 pages of notes from the night before. She picked up her pen and went back to work. Outside, the October afternoon was doing its thing. The light was coming in at an angle across the table, landing on the legal pad, making the yellow paper look almost luminous. And she wrote, "The scope of the admissibility ruling at page 23. The defense cannot selectively present the service bulletin as evidence of Hayden's notice, while simultaneously arguing the maintenance work order was improperly admitted as irrelevant. The 2 documents form a continuous evidentiary chain. Motion to admit or exclude both or neither." She circled the last 4 words. She moved on to the next page. The light shifted. The coffee cooled slightly. She refilled it from the machine without getting up, because the machine was within reach, which had been a deliberate choice when she arranged the kitchen. She had arranged everything in this apartment deliberately. Not extravagantly. Deliberately. The desk near the window for the light. The bookshelf where she could see it from the kitchen. Yeah, the good kitchen knife that cost $40 more than the one she'd had before, and which would last, the review had said, approximately 15 years if properly maintained. Long term. She was thinking in terms of long term now. She hadn't done that in her first life. In her first life, she had thought in terms of the current month and the next one, and never further, because further had seemed like a country she didn't have a visa for. The accident and the settlement and the dwindling money had enforced a particular short-sightedness, had reduced the horizon to whatever was immediately in front of her. Now the horizon had moved. She turned to the next page of the brief. She read. She made a note. She crossed out the note and rewrote it more precisely. From the street below came the sound of traffic. The particular frequency of the city doing what the city does. Present, indifferent, ongoing. A siren somewhere. The bus on the cross street 2 blocks north, its doors opening and closing. She worked until the light was gone, and the apartment had gone from afternoon to evening around her, the warm linen walls shifting from pale gold to something softer, Something that did not have a name in the paint swatch catalog, just the particular quality of a room at dusk in October in a city that has not stopped moving. She reached across and turned on the desk lamp. She kept working. 3 months after the verdict, Judge Hale issued a ruling on the Hayden appeal. The ruling was 11 pages. Serena read all 11 pages twice, once for the substance and once for the language, like the way Eleanor had taught her to read rulings. First for the outcome, then for the reasoning, because the reasoning was where the next case lived. The appeal was denied on all 3 grounds. On the constitutional ratio question, Hale cited the same catalog of comparable verdicts that Serena had included in the friend of the court brief. She cited it by name, quoted the median ratio, and noted that the jury's award fell within the established range for cases involving demonstrably suppressed safety documentation. Serena read that paragraph twice. Not because it surprised her. She had expected this outcome with approximately 75% confidence, which was the closest she allowed herself to certainty. She read it twice because there was something in seeing your own work, the 12 nights of research. The 23 comparable verdicts, the careful calculation of medians and ranges, appear in a federal court ruling transformed into the neutral, authoritative language of the law that had a particular quality she could not entirely name. Not vindication. That word was too large and too morally resonant, and she had always distrusted morally resonant words because they implied a settled accounting that never quite matched the texture of actual events. Something smaller than vindication. More specific. The feeling of a measurement confirmed. She emailed Eleanor, appeal denied, 11 pages. I'll send annotations by end of week. Eleanor replied, I saw, you were right about the ratio argument. Well done. Serena read the reply. She set her phone face down on the desk. She turned back to her legal pad. There was a case she had started reading about, not hers. Not directly. And a class of warehouse workers at a different company, different state, different equipment, but with a pattern in the incident reporting that had caught her attention in a court filing she had come across while researching a tangential issue in the Hayden appeal. The pattern was familiar. Reclassifications, non-escalation of maintenance anomalies, settlements that closed individual claims without touching the underlying equipment issue. She made a note on the legal pad. It was a short note, 4 lines, 3 questions, 2-page citations. She circled one of the questions. She picked up her phone. She called Eleanor Marsh. Eleanor answered on the second ring. I need 15 minutes, Serena said. I found something. She had sent Eleanor the Ohio case notes the night before. 7 pages, annotated, with a cover note that explained the parallel pattern in 3 sentences and asked the one question that mattered. If the variance condition violation in the Vantage case supported the punitive damages theory, did a structurally identical violation in the Ohio case support the same theory? And if so, what was the difference in the applicable state statute of limitations? Eleanor's response had been, come in Thursday. Bring the OSHA filings. It was Tuesday. In the 2 days between Tuesday and Thursday, Serena filed 3 records requests, read 2 state court decisions on products liability punitive standards in Ohio, and found a 4th plaintiff, a woman named Bethany Cole, 41, who had worked at the Ohio facility for 6 years and who had a workers' comp claim on file from 14 months ago that had been settled quickly. Too quickly, in the way that speed in a settlement usually meant someone was buying silence before the price went up. Bethany Cole's settlement agreement was not publicly accessible, but her OSHA injury report was, and the OSHA injury report had the same classification anomaly, initially coded as equipment malfunction, revised within 72 hours to operator error. Serena called Eleanor on Wednesday evening to relay the Bethany Cole information. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. I'm going to ask you something, Eleanor said. All right. Are you planning to practice law? A pause. Serena looked at her legal pad. The Ohio notes. But the LSAT confirmation she had printed and tacked to the wall above her desk, because she was someone who needed to see things on walls to make them real. Yes, she said. Then I want to offer you something. Not a formal arrangement yet. You're not barred. But Casey needs help on the Ohio preliminary research, and my bandwidth is not... I am not unlimited. A pause. I would pay a research consultant rate for documented hours. We could formalize it properly once you're licensed. The word licensed landed in the room with a particular weight, not heavy, the weight of a thing that is real and approaching. The LSAT is in February, Serena said. I know, Casey told me. If I do well, you'll do well, Eleanor said in the tone she used when she had evaluated something and reached a conclusion she considered final. Serena looked at the LSAT confirmation on the wall. She thought about the woman she had been in the apartment with yellow walls in her first life, eating lunches in 17 minutes, filing freight manifests, absorbing the particular low-grade diminishment of a system that was very good at making people feel like they were exactly the size it assigned them. She was not that size. She had never been that size. She had just not yet been given reason to find out. Send me the Ohio retainer agreement, she said. I'll review it tonight. It's already in your email, Eleanor said. She hung up. Serena turned to her computer. She opened the email. She read the retainer agreement with the same small, precise attention she brought to everything, noting 3 clauses, making 2 amendments in the margins, was identifying 1 ambiguity in the scope definition that she would raise in the Thursday meeting. She sent her markup back to Eleanor at 11:14 p.m. Eleanor's reply arrived at 11:47 p.m. It read, in its entirety, accepted. See you Thursday. Serena read the reply. She set her phone down. She looked at the Ohio case notes on her legal pad, at the 3 questions she had circled and recircled, at the name written in capitals at the top of the page. She picked up her pen. The cursor on her laptop blinked. She turned to a new page. She started writing. The Ohio case had 17 moving parts that she had identified so far, and she was fairly certain there were more she hadn't found yet. That was how these things worked. You identified the visible structure first. The named plaintiffs, the documented injuries, the filed reports. And then you went looking for the parts that had been deliberately unmapped, the parts that existed only in internal files and work orders and service communications that lived inside the defendant's document systems until a discovery request forced them into daylight. She had gotten good at knowing what to ask for. This was, she was coming to understand, a transferable skill, not specific to Vantage or to Hayden or to hydraulic platform lifts in northeastern warehouses. The architecture of institutional concealment was remarkably consistent across industries. You suppressed the same kinds of documents in the same kinds of ways for the same kinds of reasons. And the trace evidence was always somewhere in the variance records and the maintenance logs and the quietly revised incident classifications. Because someone always wrote it down, that was the thing she kept coming back to, the thing the jury's logistics coordinator had named in her letter with such precision. Organizations wrote things down. They had to. They were too large and too distributed to operate on unrecorded knowledge. And what they wrote, in the specific granular language of maintenance work orders and risk management classifications and variance applications, was a record of what they knew and when they knew it, and what they decided to do or not do with that knowledge. You just had to know where to look, and how to read what you found, and how to put it in front of 12 strangers in a way that let them see it clearly. She wrote for an hour. The city quieted around her, the particular quality of quiet that urban neighborhoods reach after midnight. Not silence, but a reduction. The active frequencies going down. She wrote until the legal pad was full, and she had to flip to a new one. And then she wrote 2 more pages on the new pad and stopped because the stopping point was clear. The way a calculation has a natural resting place when you've followed it far enough to know what the next step requires. She put the pen down. She looked at what she had written. 17 moving parts, now organized into 4 categories, each with a research priority and a potential document request and a question about applicable statute. The kind of organized structure that would walk into a room on Thursday morning and make Eleanor Marsh take out her own legal pad and start making notes. Serena tore the pages off the pads carefully along the perforations and stacked them in order. She put them in the leather folder, which now contained 3 active matters in tabbed sections. She closed the clasp. She looked at the wall where the LSAT confirmation was tacked. February. 12 weeks. She had read the logic games section description in the prep materials Casey had sent. It involved analyzing conditional statements and drawing conclusions from constrained sets of rules. Exactly the cognitive structure she had been practicing informally and unknowingly, for the last 14 months. Every time she had worked through the release language question, every time she had mapped the evidentiary chain from the service bulletin to the variance condition to the maintenance work order to the injury to the reclassification, every time she had turned over a document and asked, given what is stated here, what must necessarily follow? Logic games. She had been doing logic games her whole career. She turned off the desk lamp. The apartment settled into its evening version of itself. The warm linen walls going gray in the dark, the city doing its reduced frequency thing outside the windows, the coffee machine on the counter with its small indicator light still green. She went to bed. She set her alarm for 5:45 because she was going to run in the morning, something she had started doing 3 months ago, not for any reason she could have explained on the first day, but which had become, over time, a necessary part of the mornings. The cold air, the empty streets, the sensation of covering distance under her own power, one block and then the next, the city not yet fully awake around her. The particular quality of agency that comes from choosing to be outside and moving when no one requires it of you. She had not run in her first life. She hadn't had the time, or had believed she didn't, which was the same thing as not having it. She had the time now. She closed her eyes. She was asleep in 4 minutes. Thursday, she would walk into Eleanor Marsh's office with 17 moving parts organized into 4 categories. And she would sit down and open the leather folder and she would begin. She had already begun.